My name is Seraphina, I'm 28, and I just watched my entire family's world crumble with 4 simple words. It started at what should have been a perfect family dinner. Mom's famous lasagna. Dad carving the roast, my sister Mallory glowing about her upcoming wedding. Everything seemed picture perfect, until Mom turned to me with that familiar disappointed look and said, "Your sister's wedding will be perfect. When's your turn?" Without thinking, I replied, "It already happened." The silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was the sound of 20 years of lies, finally catching up to everyone. Hey everyone, before we dive into this family drama that'll make your jaw drop, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below if you're ready for a story about family secrets, betrayal, and the sweetest revenge you've ever heard. Smash that like button and hit subscribe, because trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Mom's fork clattered against her plate. Dad stopped mid-chew, and Mallory's engagement ring caught the light as her hand froze halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean it already happened?" Mom's voice was barely a whisper, the kind that comes before a scream. I should probably back up. Growing up, I was always the difficult one. While Mallory was homecoming queen, I was reading philosophy books in the library. While she dated the quarterback, I was building websites for local businesses. While she studied elementary education because it's perfect for future moms, I got my computer science degree and landed a job at a tech startup in Seattle. The family dynamic was crystal clear. Mallory was the golden child destined for the white picket fence life Mom had always dreamed of, and I was the black sheep who'd hopefully figure it out eventually. Every family gathering was the same script. Endless praise for Mallory's achievements, followed by thinly veiled disappointment about my life choices. But here's what they didn't know. I'd been married for 3 years. Not to some tech bro or startup founder, but to Elena Martinez, a brilliant immigration lawyer I met at a conference in Portland. We had a small, intimate ceremony at Cannon Beach, with just our closest friends overlooking the Pacific as the sun set behind us. It was perfect. Genuine, meaningful, and completely ours. Why didn't I tell them? Because 6 months before I met Elena, I'd brought my ex-girlfriend Rachel to Christmas dinner. I was 23, nervous but excited to finally share this part of myself with my family. The reaction was swift and brutal. Dad didn't speak to me for the entire meal. Mom spent the evening making pointed comments about phases and confused young people. Mallory just looked embarrassed, like I'd intentionally ruined her perfect family image. The final blow came when I overheard Mom on the phone with her sister later that night. "It's just attention-seeking behavior. She'll grow out of it once she meets the right man. We just need to be patient and not enable this nonsense." That night I made a decision. If my family couldn't accept who I was, they didn't deserve to be part of my happiness. So when I met Elena, when we fell in love, when we decided to build a life together, I kept it separate. I attended family functions alone, deflected questions about dating, and let them believe whatever narrative made them comfortable. The irony wasn't lost on me. While they worried about my failed love life, I was living in a beautiful craftsman house in Capitol Hill with my wife, hosting dinner parties with our friend group, traveling to Elena's family reunions where I was welcomed with open. Elena's parents didn't just accept our relationship, they celebrated it. Her mother taught me to make authentic tamales. Her father included me in his weekend fishing trips, and her siblings treated me like I'd always been part of the family. Meanwhile, every family gathering became an exercise in patience. Mom's constant hints about dating apps, Dad's awkward attempts to set me up with his colleagues' sons, Mallory's pitying looks when she talked about wedding planning. It all washed over me because I knew something they didn't. I wasn't the family disappointment they thought I was. I was just disappointingly honest about who I loved. The secret became easier to keep as time went on. My family lived in Ohio, I lived in Seattle. They were content with surface-level phone calls and holiday visits. They never asked hard questions because they were afraid of answers that didn't fit their worldview. But tonight, something snapped. Maybe it was Mom's tone, so certain that Mallory's traditional wedding was somehow superior to anything I could achieve. Maybe it was the way she said "when's your turn" like marriage was some kind of race that Mallory was winning by default. Or maybe it was just 3 years of watching my wife pretend to be my roommate during family video calls, because I was too much of a coward to tell the truth. "What do you mean it already happened?" Mom repeated, her voice climbing an octave. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my favorite photo. Elena and me on our wedding day. Her in a stunning off-white dress with intricate lace sleeves. Me in a navy blue suit. Both of us laughing as the ocean wind whipped our hair around our faces. I set the phone in the middle of the dinner table like I was playing a trump card. The silence stretched so long I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking. Dad's face went through several color changes, settling on a pale green that matched the walls. Mom stared at the photo like it might disappear if she didn't blink. Mallory was the first to speak. "Who is she?" Her voice was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight tremor. "My wife. Elena Martinez. We've been married for 3 years, together for 4. I kept my voice steady, matter of fact. "She's an immigration lawyer. We have a house in Seattle, a dog named Fitzgerald, and we're planning to start trying for kids next year." The aftermath was exactly what I'd expected, and somehow worse than I'd imagined. Dad pushed back from the table and walked to the kitchen without a word. Mom's face cycled through confusion, hurt, and finally anger. But it was Mallory's reaction that surprised me most. 3 years, she wasn't looking at me anymore but staring down at her own engagement ring. "You've been married for 3 years and never told us." The accusation in her voice sparked something defensive in me. Would it have mattered? You all made it pretty clear how you felt about my lifestyle choices after the Rachel incident. "That was different," Mom interjected, finding her voice again. "You were young, experimenting. I was 23, Mom. Old enough to know who I was. And apparently old enough for you to decide who I wasn't allowed to be." Dad returned from the kitchen with a beer, avoiding eye contact. The family dinner that started with talk of wedding flowers and seating charts now felt like a war zone. But something strange was happening. Instead of the guilt I'd expected to feel, I was experiencing a clarity I hadn't felt in years. For so long, I'd told myself I was protecting my family's feelings by keeping Elena a secret. But sitting there, watching them struggle to process information about my happiness, I realized I hadn't been protecting them at all. I'd been protecting myself from their disappointment, their potential rejection, their inability to celebrate my joy the way they celebrated Mallory's. "I want to meet her," Mallory said suddenly. Everyone turned to stare at her. "Elena, I want to meet your wife." Mom's head snapped toward her youngest daughter. "Mallory, you don't understand. I understand perfectly." Mallory's voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "I understand that my sister found love and got married, and I wasn't invited to her wedding because we've apparently created a family where she felt like she couldn't be honest with us." The words hit like physical blows. Dad took a long pull from his beer. Mom's mouth opened and closed without sound. And I sat there stunned as my little sister, the one I'd always seen as the perfect princess living in a fairy tale, suddenly seemed more adult than any of us. "It's more complicated than that," I started, but Mallory cut me off. "Is it because, from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty simple? You fell in love, you got married, and instead of sharing that happiness with your family, you kept it secret because you were afraid we'd disappoint you. And honestly, looking at this reaction, I think you were probably right to be afraid." The observation was so painfully accurate it took my breath away. In all my planning for this moment, and I had been planning it somewhere in the back of my mind for years, I'd focused on defending myself against their reactions. I'd never considered that their reactions might prove exactly why I'd been right to keep the secret in the first place. "I have wedding photos," I said quietly. "If you really want to see them." Mallory nodded immediately. Mom looked like she might be sick. Dad finished his beer and went for another one. I scrolled through my phone to the album Elena's cousin had put together. Professional shots mixed with candid moments from our friends. Elena dancing with her father while I watched from the sidelines, tears streaming down my face. Me spinning her around on the beach while our friends cheered in the background. The two of us cutting our small but elegant cake while Elena's mother snapped pictures with unabashed joy. "She's beautiful," Mallory whispered, and I heard genuine warmth in her voice. "You both look so happy." "We are happy." I looked up from the phone to find her watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "We're really, really happy." "Good." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You deserve to be happy." It should have been a touching family moment, but Mom chose that instant to find her voice again. "How could you do this to us, Seraphina? How could you lie for 3 years? Do you have any idea how this makes us look? What are we supposed to tell people?" And there it was. The real issue. Not my happiness, not Elena's place in the family, not even their own feelings about my sexuality. What would people think? How would this reflect on them? "Tell people whatever makes you comfortable, Mom. You've been doing that my whole life anyway." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. Years of swallowed resentment were bubbling to the surface, and I found I didn't have the energy to keep pushing them down. "That's not fair," Dad said from the doorway, beer number 2 already half empty. "We've always supported you." "Have you?" Because I remember a very different conversation after I brought Rachel home for Christmas. I remember Mom telling Aunt Linda it was just a phase. I remember you avoiding me for months afterward. "You're taking that out of context," Mom protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Because that experience taught me everything I needed to know about how this family handles things that don't fit the perfect picture. So, yeah, I got married without you. I built a life without you. And honestly, it's been a pretty great life. The silence that followed felt different. Heavier, more final. Mallory was still holding my hand, but she was looking between our parents with something that looked like disappointment. Dad was studying his beer label like it contained the secrets of the universe. And Mom was crying quiet, controlled tears that somehow made everything worse. "I think," Mallory said carefully, "we need to talk about how we move forward from here. Because Sarah is married, Elena is family now, whether we handle this well or badly, and I, for one, would like to handle it well." I stared at my little sister with new respect. When had she become the reasonable one? What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my family dynamics. Mallory stood up from the dinner table, walked over to where Dad was hovering in the kitchen doorway, and took his beer right out of his hands. "Sit down, Dad. We're going to have a real conversation for once, instead of everyone just pretending everything is fine while Sarah suffers in silence." Dad looked so shocked he actually obeyed. Mom stopped crying long enough to stare at her youngest daughter like she'd grown a second head. And I sat there wondering when my baby sister had turned into someone I barely recognized. "Here's what I know," Mallory continued, settling back into her chair but maintaining that commanding tone. "Sarah has been coming to family gatherings for 3 years, smiling and nodding while we talked about her failed love life, while Mom made pointed comments about biological clocks and settling down, while Dad tried to set her up with random men from his office. And the whole time she was married to someone she loved enough to build a life with." She turned to look directly at our parents. "Do you understand how cruel that must have been, watching us pity her while she was actually living the exact life we claimed to want for her?" "We didn't know," Mom started. "Because she couldn't tell us," Mallory's voice rose slightly. "Because we created an environment where she felt like she had to choose between being honest and being accepted. And honestly, that says a lot more about us than it does about her." I was starting to understand why Mallory had been so successful in her teaching career. When she wanted to be heard, she commanded attention in a way that felt both natural and absolute. "I want to know about Elena," she continued, turning back to me. "I want to know how you met, what she's like, what your life together looks like. And I want Mom and Dad to listen without interrupting, without making it about their feelings, and without making you feel like you have to defend your happiness." It was such an unexpected reversal that I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. For years, I'd been the big sister trying to protect Mallory from family drama, shielding her from the worst of the dysfunction. But apparently she'd been paying attention all along. "We met at a tech conference in Portland." I began, my voice slightly unsteady. "She was giving a presentation on digital privacy rights for immigrant communities. I was in the audience because our startup was developing an app for refugee resource coordination. During the Q&A, I asked a question about data protection, and she gave this incredibly thorough answer that showed she understood both the legal and technical sides better than anyone I'd ever met. I pulled up another photo on my phone. Elena, at her law firm's holiday party last year. Animated and gesturing, while explaining something to a colleague. Her eyes bright with passion for her work. She's brilliant. Not just smart, but genuinely brilliant in this way that makes everyone around her want to be better. She speaks 4 languages, she's argued, cases in federal court, and she volunteers teaching citizenship classes on weekends. But she's also funny and kind, and patient with my family's dog when we visit for holidays, and she makes these elaborate Sunday brunches where she tries to recreate dishes from places we've traveled. "What's she like with you?" Mallory asked softly, and something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. "She sees me," I said simply. "Not who she thinks I should be, not some potential version of me, but exactly who I am right now. She celebrates my successes without taking credit for them, she supports me through failures without trying to fix everything, and she makes me laugh every single day. Even when we disagree about stuff, we work through it together instead of someone just giving in to keep the peace." I realized as I was saying it that I was describing something my parents had never modeled for us. Their relationship was built on assigned roles and unspoken expectations, not genuine partnership. "She sounds wonderful," Mallory said, and there was something wistful in her voice that made me pause. "She is. And you know what, when I told her family about you guys, when I explained why I hadn't brought her to meet you yet, Elena's mom said something that stuck with me. She said families aren't just about blood, they're about who shows up for your happiness without conditions." Mom flinched like I'd slapped her, and Dad was looking everywhere except at me. But Mallory nodded slowly, like she understood exactly what I meant. "Can I tell you something?" Mallory's voice was quiet now, almost hesitant. "Something I've never told anyone in this family." The shift in tone made everyone lean forward slightly. Even Mom stopped sniffling. "Brad and I have been engaged for 8 months, and we've been to 3 rounds of couples counseling because we can't agree on fundamental things about our future. We want different things from life, we argue about money constantly, and half the time I feel like I'm marrying him because it's what everyone expects, not because I can't imagine my life without him." The confession hit the room like a bomb. Mom's face went white. Dad actually looked up from his beer. And I felt something shift inside my chest. A protective instinct I'd been suppressing for years. Mallory Mom started, but my sister held up a hand. "I'm not done. I've been watching Sierra's face every time we talk about wedding planning, and I kept thinking she looked sad because she wasn't getting the fairy tale wedding. But now I realize she was probably sad because I was settling for something that looked right instead of waiting for something that felt right." She turned to look at me directly. "I want what you have with Elena. I want someone who sees me, who chooses me every day, who makes me laugh and supports my dreams, and doesn't try to turn me into some version of myself that fits better into their life plan." "Then why haven't you broken up with Brad?" I asked gently. "Because I'm scared," she admitted. "Because this family has very clear expectations about what success looks like, and I've never been brave enough to disappoint people the way you have. But watching you tonight, seeing how happy you look when you talk about Elena, I'm starting to think maybe disappointing people isn't the worst thing that could happen. Maybe the worst thing would be living a lie to make other people comfortable." The room fell completely silent. Even the grandfather clock seemed to pause its ticking. And in that silence, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family was wrong. Mallory wasn't the golden child living a perfect life. She was just as trapped by expectations as I had been. Maybe more so because she'd never figured out how to break free. "You know what," I said, pulling out my phone again. "I'm calling Elena. It's only 6:30 in Seattle and she's probably just finishing dinner. I want her to meet my sister." Mom made a small noise of protest, but I was already dialing. As the phone rang, I caught Mallory's eye and smiled. "Fair warning. She's going to love you immediately. And probably offer to help you figure out the Brad situation whether you want help or not. She's very much a fixer." For the first time all evening, Mallory smiled back and it reached her eyes. "Good. I think I could use someone like that in my corner." When Elena answered the phone, her voice warm and familiar across the distance, I felt something settle into place that I hadn't even realized was broken. "Hi, love. I have someone here who wants to meet you." Elena's voice filled the kitchen through my phone's speaker, warm and curious. "Hi there, Seraphina has told me so much about all of you. I'm Elena." The response was immediate and telling. Mallory lit up like Christmas morning. "Elena, oh my God, it's so nice to finally meet you. I'm Mallory, Sarah's sister. The teacher Sarah talks about you constantly. She's so proud of the literacy program you started at your school." I watched Mallory's face transform with surprise and something that looked like relief. In our family, accomplishments were acknowledged with a pat on the head and quickly moved past. Elena's genuine enthusiasm about details I'd shared months ago was clearly foreign territory. "She told you about that." Mallory's voice was soft with wonder. "Are you kidding? She has pictures of your kids' reading celebration on her desk at work. She brags about you to anyone who'll listen." Mom and Dad were sitting in stunned silence watching this easy warmth between Elena and Mallory unfold. I realized they were seeing what I'd been experiencing for 4 years. Unconditional enthusiasm for our successes, genuine interest in our lives, and the kind of familial love that didn't come with conditions or expectations. "Elena," I said, "Mallory was just telling us about some decisions she's working through. I thought you might have some perspective." What happened next was pure Elena magic. Over the course of 20 minutes, she managed to ask Mallory thoughtful questions about her relationship concerns. Without once suggesting what Mallory should do, she shared stories about couples she'd worked with in her immigration practice. People who'd risked everything to be together. People who'd discovered their relationships couldn't survive major life changes. People who'd found strength they didn't know they had when they finally stopped living for other people's approval. "The thing is," Elena said after Mallory had explained the Brad situation, "marriage isn't about finding someone who fits into your existing life. It's about finding someone you want to build a completely new life with. Someone who makes you excited about becoming the person you're going to be 10 years from now." But what if that person disappoints people? What if choosing what makes you happy means other people think you're making a mistake? Elena laughed, not mockingly, but with real affection. "Honey, I'm a gay Mexican-American woman who married into a white Ohio family that didn't know I existed until tonight. If I worried about disappointing people, I'd never get out of bed." Even Dad cracked a smile at that one. Besides, Elena continued, "The people who really love you want you to be happy more than they want you to be convenient. And if someone's love comes with conditions about who you're allowed to love or how you're supposed to live, that's not really love anyway, that's control." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mom's face had gone very pale, and Dad was staring into his beer like it contained the meaning of life. But Mallory was nodding slowly, and I could see something shifting behind her eyes. Mallory's voice was tentative. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "How did you know Sarah was worth risking everything for?" The question caught me off guard. I'd never thought about our relationship in terms of risk and reward, but I realized that for Elena, loving me had meant risking rejection from my family, dealing with the secrecy and building a life that excluded people who should have been important to both of us. "I didn't know," Elena said, simply. "Not at first. But I knew how I felt when I was with her. I knew that she made me want to be braver, kinder, more honest. I knew that when I imagined my future, every version of it that made me happy included her. And I knew that a love that required me to hide or diminish parts of myself wasn't worth having, but a love that celebrated all of me was worth fighting for." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler. "But Mallory, I also knew that Seraphina was worth it because of how she talks about the people she loves. Even when she was hurt by your family's reactions, even when she felt like she couldn't be honest with you, she never stopped loving you. She never stopped hoping things could be different. Someone who loves that deeply, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, that's someone worth risking everything for." I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but they weren't sad tears. For the first time in years, I felt completely seen and completely loved, not despite my complications but because of my whole messy, complicated self. "I want to meet you in person," Mallory said suddenly. I want Brad to meet you too, actually. I think seeing what a real partnership looks like might help us figure out if we have one or if we're just really good at pretending. I would love that, Elena said immediately. Actually, Sierra, what if Mallory came to Seattle for a weekend? She could stay in the guest room, meet our friends, see what our life actually looks like. The suggestion was so perfectly Elena. Generous, inclusive, and completely practical. But it also represented something bigger. She was offering to welcome my family into our world, not demanding that we hide or minimize our life to make them comfortable. I'd love that, Mallory said, and there was real excitement in her voice for the first time all evening. Mom finally found her voice. Mallory, your wedding is in 3 months. You can't just. I can't just. What? Mom. Take a weekend to visit my sister and her wife. Spend some time thinking about what I actually want my life to look like, instead of just planning a party. The word wife. Coming. So naturally from Mallory's mouth hit me like a physical embrace. She wasn't just accepting Elena, she was claiming her as family. Besides, Mallory continued, her voice gaining strength. Maybe it's time I stopped planning a wedding and started thinking about whether I actually want the marriage that comes after it. Dad set down his beer and looked directly at me for the first time since I'd shown them the wedding photo. Seraphina, I owe you an apology. The words were so unexpected that everyone fell silent. When you brought Rachel home, I didn't handle it well. I was scared. Scared of what it meant, scared of what people would think, scared that I didn't know how to be a good father to a daughter I didn't understand. And instead of admitting that and trying to learn, I just withdrew. I made you feel like loving someone was something to be ashamed of, and that was wrong. His voice was steady but quiet, like he was forcing himself to say words that didn't come naturally. I can't undo that. But I can tell you that listening to Elena tonight, hearing how much she obviously loves you, seeing how happy you look when you talk about your life together, I'm proud of you. I'm proud that you were brave enough to build the life you wanted, even when we made it clear we might not support it. And I'm sorry it took me this long to say that. The apology hit me harder than any anger could have. I'd been prepared for rejection, for arguments, for ultimatums. I hadn't been prepared for accountability. Thank you, I managed, my voice thick with unexpected emotion. That means more than you know. Elena, Dad's voice was hesitant. Would you and Seraphina consider coming to Mallory's wedding? I know we have a lot to work through, but I'd like to try. If you're willing to give us a chance. Through the phone, I heard Elena's sharp intake of breath. Mr. Chen, I would be honored to be there. If Mallory and Seraphina want us there. I do, Mallory said immediately. I absolutely do. But only if you're comfortable with it, Sarah. This is your call. I looked around the table. At Dad, who was making eye contact for the first time in years. At Mallory, who was looking at me with something that might have been admiration. At Mom, who was still crying but nodding slowly like she was processing something big. And I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I might actually belong in this family. The next 2 hours changed everything. Elena stayed on the phone while we looked through wedding photos, sharing stories about our friends, our house, our weekend hiking routine, even our ridiculous arguments about who was responsible for keeping the succulents alive. She answered Mom's tentative questions about her work, told Dad funny stories about my cooking disasters, and treated every family photo Mallory showed her like a treasured artifact. But the real transformation happened when Mom finally asked the question I'd been dreading. Elena, what do your parents think about all this, about Seraphina's family being so? She struggled for the right word. Confused, Elena suggested gently. Because that's what I told them you were. Not evil or hateful, just confused about how to love someone whose life looked different from what you'd planned. It was such a kind interpretation of years of rejection that Mom actually started crying harder. They want to meet you all, Elena continued. My mom has been asking about Sierra's family since our second date. She keeps saying she wants to thank you for raising someone so loyal and principled, even if you don't always see eye to eye on everything. The idea that Elena's family wanted to thank them for raising me seemed to genuinely shock my parents. I realized that in their minds my sexuality had been a failure of their parenting rather than simply part of who I was. They really said that Mom's voice was small. My mom specifically said that anyone who could love someone as deeply as Sera loves her family even when it's complicated had to have been raised with strong values. She said she was looking forward to meeting the people who taught their daughter that family is something worth fighting for, not something to walk away from when it gets hard. I watched my parents absorb this reframe of everything they thought they knew about the situation. In Elena's family's eyes, my refusal to give up on them wasn't evidence of my failure to establish appropriate boundaries. It was evidence of the love and loyalty they'd instilled in me. I think Dad said slowly, "We've been looking at this all wrong for a very long time." "Yeah," I agreed. "I think you have." "Can we start over?" Mom's voice was tentative but genuine. "Can we meet Elena properly and try to do this right?" Before I could answer, Mallory cleared her throat. "Actually, there's something else we need to talk about. Something I've been thinking about while listening to Elena and Sera tonight." She looked down at her engagement ring, turning it around and around on her finger. "I'm calling off the wedding." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Mom gasped. Dad straightened up so fast he knocked over his empty beer bottle. And I felt a surge of pride for my little sister that nearly took my breath away. "Mallory, you can't." Mom started. "I can and I am." Mallory's voice was calm, decided. "I've been trying to convince myself that cold feet were normal, that every bride has doubts, that Brad and I just needed to work harder at understanding each other. But listening to Elena talk about building a life with someone, about being excited about who you're becoming together, I realized I don't feel any of that with Brad." She looked up at me. "I feel like I'm trying to squeeze myself into a life that looks right, but feels wrong." And watching Sera tonight, seeing how she glows when she talks about Elena, I realized that I deserve to feel that way about someone too. But the deposits, the venue, the invitations, Mom was spiraling into logistics panic. "Can all be canceled or changed," Mallory said firmly. "Mom, I'd rather lose money on deposits than spend the next 50 years feeling like I settled for someone who was good enough, instead of waiting for someone who was perfect for me." "Brad isn't going to understand," Dad began. "Then he's not the right person for me," Mallory said simply. "The right person would understand that I need to be sure. The right person would want me to be sure." She stood up and walked around the table to where I was sitting. "I want what you have, Sera. I want someone who makes me brave enough to disappoint people if it means being honest about what makes me happy." I hugged her, then really hugged her, maybe for the first time since we were kids. And I realized that all these years, I'd been protecting the wrong person. Mallory didn't need protection from family drama. She needed someone to show her that it was okay to choose herself even when it was hard. "Elena," Mallory said, turning back to the phone. "That invitation to visit Seattle. How soon can I take you up on it?" "How about next weekend?" Elena said immediately. "I'll pick you up at the airport and we'll spend the whole time figuring out what you actually want your life to look like." "Perfect." Mallory grinned. "And Sera, I want to be there when you tell Elena's family about tonight. I want to see what it looks like when a family celebrates good news instead of trying to manage it." I felt something shift inside my chest, like a door that had been locked for years finally opening. For the first time since I was 23 years old, I felt like I might actually get to have both things I'd wanted, most the love I'd found with Elena, and the family I'd grown up in. "There's one more thing," I said, looking around the table. "Elena and I are planning to start trying for kids next year. IVF, probably using a donor. I wanted you to know that if we're successful, if we have children, I want them to know their grandparents and their aunt. But only if you're ready to be the kind of grandparents who celebrate their family for who we are, not who you wish we were." The silence that followed was different from all the earlier silences. This one felt full of possibility instead of tension. "I would like that very much," Dad said quietly. "I would like a chance to be a better grandfather than I was a father." Mom nodded, tears streaming down her face again. "I want that too. I want to do better." "Good," I said. "Because Elena's already picked out nursery colors, and she's going to want to talk your ear off about cribs and strollers and organic baby food the minute she thinks you're interested." For the first time all evening, Mom actually smiled. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." 6 months later, I stood in Elena's parents' backyard in Portland, watching my wife chase our 18-month-old niece around the garden, while Mallory and her new girlfriend Sarah laughed from the porch swing. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so genuinely joyful, that I had to pause just to take it in. Mallory had indeed called off her wedding. The conversation with Brad had gone about as well as expected. He'd accused her of having a quarter-life crisis, suggested she was being influenced by my lifestyle, and generally proved that she'd made exactly the right decision. The relief on her face when she told me about it was worth every penny of the lost deposits. She'd spent that weekend in Seattle falling in love with our life. Not romantically, but in the way you fall in love with a possibility you didn't know existed. Elena had introduced her to our friend group, which included several other teachers, and she'd ended up staying an extra 3 days, just talking shop about educational philosophy and inclusive curriculum design. But the real magic had happened when Sarah, Elena's coworker and friend, had offered to show Mallory around Portland's food scene the following month. What started as a friendly gesture had turned into long phone calls, weekend visits, and finally, Mallory making the terrifying but exhilarating decision to apply for teaching positions in Oregon. She'd moved to Portland 4 months ago into a cute apartment in the same neighborhood as Sarah's place. They'd been officially dating for 2 months, but anyone with eyes could see they'd been falling in love since their first conversation about immigration policy and educational equity. The family dynamics had shifted dramatically. Mom and Dad had come to Seattle for Christmas, where Elena's warmth and genuine interest in their stories had melted the last of their reservations. They'd spent the entire visit taking pictures to show Elena's parents planning a summer trip to meet them, and generally behaving like the loving, supportive family I'd always hoped they could be. The transformation wasn't complete. There were still awkward moments, still times when their ingrained assumptions surfaced in uncomfortable ways. But they were trying, genuinely trying, and that effort meant everything. Sarah Elena called from across the yard where she was now being used as a jungle gym by 3 different children. "Your mom texted, they landed in Portland an hour ago. They should be here for dinner." My parents had started making regular trips to Portland, ostensibly to visit Mallory, but really to be part of this chosen family we'd all built together. Elena's parents had welcomed them with the same generous warmth they'd shown me from day one, and watching my dad bond with Elena's father over their shared love of fishing had been one of the most unexpectedly healing experiences of my life. "How are you feeling about tonight?" Sarah asked, settling into the chair next to mine with a cup of Elena's mother's famous horchata. Tonight was special. Elena and I had finally gotten the call we'd been waiting for. Our IVF cycle had been successful. We were 8 weeks pregnant, and tonight was when we were telling both families together for the first time. Excited. Nervous. Grateful. I watched Elena demonstrate some complicated game involving bubbles and squealing to the assembled children. Mostly grateful, honestly. For the pregnancy, for all of it. The pregnancy, yes, but also for this. I gestured around the backyard where Elena's siblings were setting up tables, while Mallory helped Elena's mother arrange flowers. For having a family that celebrates good news instead of managing it. For Elena, obviously. For getting my sister back. For my parents figuring out how to love people without trying to change them. "You know what I love most about this story," Sarah said, watching Mallory laugh at something Elena's brother had said. "You didn't get revenge on your family. You got something better. You got them to choose growth." She was right. I'd spent years imagining confrontations, dramatic speeches, moments where I proved that their narrow-mindedness had cost them something precious. But the reality had been better than any revenge fantasy. Instead of proving them wrong, I'd given them the chance to become people who could be right. Instead of punishing them for their limitations, I'd shown them what was possible when love didn't come with conditions. "The best part," I said, "is that Elena never had to compromise who she was to fit into my family. They had to expand to include her. And in doing that, they became people who could include all of us more fully." And Mallory got to see what it looked like to choose happiness over expectations. And now our kids are going to grow up thinking it's completely normal to have multiple sets of grandparents who all show up for every important moment. I smiled, thinking about the future we were building. They're going to take for granted that love is something you celebrate, not something you hide. Elena appeared at my side, slightly out of breath, from chasing toddlers, but glowing with happiness. Ready for this? I can see your parents' rental car pulling up. More than ready. As I watched my parents get out of their car carrying gifts and wearing the slightly overwhelmed but determined expressions they wore when entering Elena's family chaos, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete integration. All the different parts of my life, my wife, my sister, my parents, my chosen family, were about to exist in the same space, celebrating the same joy. Tonight, when we announced the pregnancy, Elena's mother would cry happy tears and immediately start planning a baby shower. Elena's father would toast our future with homemade sangria and terrible dad jokes. Mallory would start making lists of all the books she wanted to read to her future nephew or niece. Sarah would offer to design the nursery. And my parents. My parents would be there for all of it. Not as reluctant participants, but as genuinely excited grandparents to be. You know what I said to Elena as we watched everyone gather around the dinner table, loud and chaotic, and perfectly imperfect? I think this might be the revenge story with the best possible ending. How so? I didn't just get justice. I got joy. We all did. And as Elena's father started one of his legendary toasts about love and family and the beautiful complications of choosing each other every day, I realized that the girl who'd been afraid to tell her family who she really was had become a woman surrounded by people who celebrated every authentic piece of her. That's not revenge. That's victory. Hey everyone, thank you so much for staying until the end of this wild family journey. I want to know, have you ever had a moment where standing up for your truth completely changed your family dynamics? Do you think karma really comes around? Or do we have to create our own justice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because I love hearing your stories and perspectives on family acceptance and finding the courage to choose happiness over other people's expectations. If this story reminded you that love shouldn't come with conditions, please hit that like button to help other people find it. And if you want to hear more real stories about family drama, personal growth, and those amazing moments when everything finally clicks into place, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that chosen family and blood family don't have to be separate things. Sometimes the best revenge is showing people how good life can be when everyone chooses love over fear. Thank you for being part of this community, where we can share these messy, beautiful, complicated stories about what it really means to build a family that celebrates who you are. Until next time, keep choosing authenticity over approval. And remember, the people who really love you want you to be happy more than they want you to be convenient. Take care.